Right now, nearly 75% of the United States sits inside a zone the U.S. Geological Survey has officially classified as capable of producing a damaging earthquake. 188 million Americans now have at least a 10% chance of feeling strong shaking in their lifetime, and that number jumped by 66% almost overnight. Not because more earthquakes started happening, because scientists quietly rewrote the math behind how we calculate the risk in the first place, and the region driving a huge part of that jump isn't even California. It's the part of the country most people would never think to worry about at all. This update happened. It's already shaping building codes and insurance rates across the country as we speak. And almost nobody outside a small circle of seismologists and risk engineers has actually heard about it. I'm your host, and this is Verge. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we go looking for. The ones where something enormous quietly shifts in the background of ordinary life. And the only people who ever really notice are the specialists whose entire job is watching for it. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what changed, why it changed, which parts of the country got the biggest and most surprising increases in risk, and why the single most dangerous fault system in America right now might not be the one you've heard about the most. Before we get into it, go ahead and subscribe because we're just getting started and there's a lot more of this kind of story coming. Let's start with the actual update itself, because you need to understand what this document is before you can understand why it matters so much. Every few years, the U.S. Geological Survey, working with dozens of universities, state geological surveys, and outside seismologists, releases something called the National Seismic Hazard Model. Think of it as the master reference document for how likely damaging shaking is in every corner of the country, block by block, decade by decade. It's not a headline-grabbing press release. It's a scientific product built from fault maps, historical earthquake records, GPS measurements of how the ground is slowly deforming, and increasingly sophisticated computer simulations of how energy from a rupture actually travels through rock and soil to reach the surface where people live. And here's the detail that matters most. This document isn't just an academic curiosity sitting in a research paper somewhere. It is the actual foundation underneath building codes, insurance premiums, and emergency planning decisions across the entire country. When this model changes, the consequences ripple outward into how buildings get designed, how much your insurance costs, and how seriously your local government prepares for the day the ground finally moves. In early 2024, the USGS released the newest version of this model, and for the first time in its history, it covered all 50 states at once, built with input from more than 50 scientists and engineers working together. Previous versions had updated pieces of the country separately and at different times, leaving gaps and inconsistencies in how different regions were compared to each other. This version fixed that, and the results were more alarming than almost anyone outside the seismology community expected. Nearly 75% of the country, according to the finished model, could experience potentially damaging earthquake shaking at some point. 37 separate states have already recorded earthquakes strong enough to cause damage at some point in their history. And in the highest risk zones, specifically California, southern Alaska, and Hawaii, some individual locations were assessed at up to a 95% probability of experiencing damaging shaking within the next 100 years. Read that number again, 95%. That's not a distant possibility. That's close to a certainty on a timescale that some homes being built today will actually still be standing to witness. But here's the part of this story that barely made it into the news coverage at all, and it's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. The single biggest jump in this new model wasn't centered on California. The number of Americans facing at least a 10% chance of feeling strong shaking rose to 188 million people, a 66% increase compared to the previous version of the model. And according to the scientists who built it, that massive increase was driven largely by newly identified seismic hazard in the northeastern United States, a part of the country that most Americans, understandably, never associate with earthquake risk at all. Meanwhile, for roughly 140 million people, about 40% of the population, the risk actually came out lower than previously thought. This wasn't a story of uniform, across-the-board fear. It was a redistribution, a genuine rewrite of who should actually be worried and who can, at least on this front, relax a little. Think about what that actually means for a second, because this is exactly the kind of shift that changes real decisions in the real world without most people ever realizing it happened. Building codes in seismically active regions require structures to be engineered to withstand a certain level of shaking, calculated directly from models exactly like this one. Insurance companies use these same hazard maps to calculate what they charge homeowners for earthquake coverage, or whether they'll offer it at all. Emergency planners use it to decide where to stockpile supplies, where to reinforce hospitals, and where to run earthquake drills in schools. When a hazard model like this shifts significantly for a region that never had to think about this risk before, the practical consequences, tighter codes, higher premiums, new emergency protocols start rolling out quietly, region by region, often with very little public discussion, because most people simply aren't tuned in to a scientific report with a name like the National Seismic Hazard Model. Now, let's actually understand why this happened, because the answer isn't as simple as scientists just guessing differently this time around. Earthquake hazard models are built by combining several completely different types of evidence. Scientists map every known active fault they can find and estimate how fast strain is building up along each one using GPS stations that can detect ground movement measured in mere millimeters per year. They dig into the historical record, sometimes going back centuries, to catalog every earthquake ever documented in a region, no matter how long ago. And critically, they build ground motion models, mathematical descriptions of exactly how shaking generated at a fault actually travels outward and behaves once it reaches the surface, because the same earthquake can feel wildly different depending on the type of soil and rock underneath a particular city. This newest update specifically improved the ground motion models used for subduction zone faults, the type of fault found along the Pacific Northwest coastline and in Alaska, where one tectonic plate dives directly underneath another, and which are capable of producing some of the largest earthquakes on the entire planet. And this is where the story starts to widen out, because once you understand that this new national model exists, and that it fundamentally reshuffled who's actually at risk, the next question becomes obvious. Where, specifically, is that risk highest right now in 2026, and what's actually happening at those specific locations that scientists are watching so closely? Let's start on the West Coast, because it's the region most people already assume carries the highest risk, and in this case, that assumption happens to be correct, just not for the reasons most people think. Southern California sits along the San Andreas Fault, the famous boundary where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind against each other. And researchers studying this fault published findings this year concluding that stress along the southern San Andreas has now reached its highest level in 1,000 years. The last major rupture along this specific stretch happened back in 1857, a magnitude 7.9 event known as the Fort Tejon earthquake. That was over a century and a half ago. For 169 consecutive years since then, the two tectonic plates on either side of that fault have kept grinding against each other at a rate of roughly 5 centimeters per year. And because that section hasn't ruptured in a major way since 1857, all of that accumulated motion has had nowhere to go except directly into stress stored in the surrounding rock. Here's the detail from that same research that deserves far more attention than it's gotten. Scientists identified a specific location called Cajon Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, where the San Andreas Fault meets a second major fault system called the San Jacinto. Researchers are calling this junction an earthquake gate, because under the right conditions, a rupture starting on the San Andreas could actually jump through this junction and continue onto the San Jacinto Fault, turning what would have been a single fault earthquake into a combined multi-fault rupture capable of producing a magnitude of somewhere between 7.4 and 7.8. Threatening not just one narrow corridor, but the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley simultaneously. Right now, stress levels on both of these fault systems are sitting close enough together at high enough levels that researchers involved in the study have described this earthquake gate as effectively unlocked. When a USC seismologist involved in this kind of research was asked when the next major event along this system might actually occur, the honest answer given was that it could be today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30 years. Because on a geological timescale, there's no meaningful difference between those options. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. If you live anywhere near a fault line, even one you've never thought much about, do you actually know what your local building codes require? Or have you just always assumed your home was built to handle it? I ask, because most people I talk to have never actually checked. And this is exactly the kind of detail that hazard models like the one we're discussing directly influence. Now, here's where the story gets stranger. And this is the part almost nobody outside specialized seismology circles is talking about. While California gets almost all of the national attention, a stretch of coastline running from Northern California up through Oregon, Washington State, and into British Columbia sits above something scientists consider even more capable of producing a truly catastrophic event. It's called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and unlike the San Andreas, which is a strike-slip fault where two plates slide horizontally past each other, Cascadia is a subduction zone where an entire oceanic plate is being forced directly underneath the North American continent. These types of faults are responsible for the largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth, including the 2011 event off the coast of Japan and the 2004 earthquake that triggered the catastrophic Indian Ocean tsunami. The last time Cascadia fully ruptured was January 26, 1700. Scientists know the exact date because Japanese historical records documented a tsunami arriving on their coastline with no local earthquake to explain it. And researchers eventually traced that tsunami directly back to a massive rupture along the Pacific Northwest coast that night. As of this year, that means the region has gone roughly 326 years without a repeat of that kind of event. Geological evidence buried in coastal sediment layers, showing repeated instances of land suddenly dropping and being flooded by tsunami waves throughout thousands of years of history, has allowed scientists to estimate how often this fault has ruptured on average throughout its history. According to research published by the USGS, by the year 2060, the Pacific Northwest will have exceeded roughly 85% of all historical recurrence intervals recorded for the southern portion of this fault, meaning the amount of time that's passed since the last rupture will already be longer than 85% of the gaps between ruptures throughout the fault's known history. This is not a guarantee that an earthquake is imminent. Earthquakes don't work on a schedule, and there is real, honest scientific uncertainty about exactly when this fault will go again. But it is a clear, data-driven signal that the region is sitting well within the range where a repeat event becomes a completely reasonable expectation, not a remote, far-off possibility. And the reason this particular fault deserves so much more public attention than it currently gets comes down to scale. A full rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone is expected by researchers to produce an earthquake in the range of magnitude 8.7 to as high as magnitude 9.2, among the largest earthquakes possible anywhere on the planet. And it would trigger a tsunami capable of reaching the coastline in as little as 15 to 20 minutes in some areas, far too fast for standard evacuation procedures that rely on official warnings alone. Millions of people live directly along this coastline today, in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, in a region that, unlike California, has spent far less of its modern history actively preparing its population and its infrastructure for an event of this specific scale. This is exactly why the updated ground motion models for subduction zones, the ones baked into that new National Seismic Hazard model we talked about earlier, matter so much. Improving how scientists calculate shaking intensity for this exact type of fault directly changes how engineers in Seattle and Portland are required to design bridges, hospitals, and high-rise buildings going forward. It's not an abstract academic exercise. It's the difference between a hospital that stays standing and operational after the ground finally moves and one that doesn't. Let's head to the other side of the country now, because this is where the real surprise in the new national model actually lives, and it's the part of this story that almost nobody talks about at all. Remember that 66% jump in the number of Americans facing meaningful earthquake risk? And remember that scientists specifically pointed to the northeastern United States as a major driver of that increase. That region includes a large, historically underestimated earthquake source running through the central part of the country as well, an area most Americans have simply never been taught to think of as earthquake territory at all. Back in the winter of 1811 and 1812, a sequence of massive earthquakes struck along what's now called the New Madrid Seismic Zone, an area running through parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, nowhere near a plate boundary the way California and the Pacific Northwest are. These earthquakes, estimated at magnitude 7 to as high as magnitude 8, were so powerful that reports from the time described church bells ringing as far away as Boston, more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter, and the earthquakes were strong enough to temporarily reverse the flow of the Mississippi River. The reason earthquakes in this part of the country can travel so much farther than earthquakes of similar size out west comes down to the geology underneath the surface. In the central and eastern United States, the bedrock is older, colder, and more rigid than the fractured younger rock found along active plate boundaries in the west. That older, harder rock transmits seismic energy far more efficiently, with far less of it getting absorbed along the way, which means a moderate earthquake in this part of the country can be felt across a dramatically larger area than an equivalent earthquake in California ever would. This is exactly the kind of regional risk that gets systematically underestimated by ordinary intuition, because the region simply hasn't produced a major earthquake within living memory, and because most of the infrastructure across the central and eastern United States was never built with serious earthquake resistance in mind, the way modern California construction has been for decades. When the new National Hazard Model recalculated risk using updated data and improved ground motion models, large sections of this part of the country came back, with meaningfully higher hazard assessments than earlier versions of the model had shown, directly contributing to that 66% jump in the total number of Americans now considered to be at meaningful risk. Here's the piece of all this that deserves to sit with you for a moment, because it connects everything we've covered so far into a single, uncomfortable truth. 3 completely different types of earthquake risk exist across this country right now, all elevated, all confirmed by the same updated scientific model, and all almost entirely absent from mainstream daily conversation. In California, decades of accumulated stress on a well-known fault system have reached levels not seen in 1,000 years, with a specific junction that researchers are now openly calling an unlocked gate. In the Pacific Northwest, an entire tectonic plate is overdue, by historical standards, for one of the largest earthquakes physically possible on this planet, threatening a coastline that hasn't fully prepared for it the way California has prepared for its own risk. And, across the central and eastern United States, an old, historically underappreciated fault system, capable of shaking cities 1,000 miles away, just received a significantly higher risk rating in the very same national report that barely made national news when it was released. Let's talk about why a report this consequential managed to stay so quiet, because that's genuinely worth understanding. Scientific hazard models like this one aren't designed to generate headlines. They're released as technical documents dense with statistical language, probability curves, and engineering terminology intended primarily for building code committees, insurance actuaries, and emergency management professionals, not for a general audience scrolling through news apps on their phone. There was no single dramatic earthquake attached to this release, no viral disaster footage driving media coverage, just an updated set of numbers in a document most Americans will never see referenced by name, even though those numbers are actively shaping decisions about the safety of the buildings they live and work in every single day. It's not that anyone deliberately hid this information. It's that the entire system by which this kind of critical scientific update gets communicated to the public is built for specialists, not for the ordinary person whose home just got quietly reclassified into a higher risk category. And that gap between how consequential this information actually is and how little public attention it receives is exactly why we're covering it here today. Let's talk about what happens next. Because this isn't a story that ends with a single report sitting on a shelf somewhere. Engineers and policymakers are already working through the practical implications of this updated model right now in real time. Building codes get revised on multi-year cycles, incorporating updated hazard data like this into new construction requirements for hospitals, schools, and high-rise buildings, particularly in regions like the Pacific Northwest and parts of the central United States that are only now being recognized as carrying meaningfully elevated risk. Insurance companies, including major risk modeling firms that work directly with this USGS data, are actively incorporating these updated numbers into how earthquake insurance gets priced across the country, which means premiums in certain regions are likely to shift as this new risk picture works its way through the industry over the coming years. There's also been real progress on the technology side that deserves mention here, because it's directly connected to how seriously different parts of the country are actually able to respond once shaking begins. California, Oregon, and Washington now operate an earthquake early warning system called Shake Alert, which uses a network of ground sensors to detect the first, faster-moving waves of an earthquake and issue an alert to phones and public systems before the slower, more destructive shaking waves actually arrive. Depending on distance from the epicenter, that can mean anywhere from a few seconds to nearly a minute of advance warning, enough time to pause a surgery, stop a train, or simply get under a sturdy table before the real shaking begins. No comparable public warning system currently exists for the central and eastern United States, precisely because that part of the country hasn't historically been treated as a serious earthquake risk. The same historical assumption that this new national hazard model just quietly overturned. Here's a detail that puts real human stakes behind all of this. In April of 2026, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off the northeastern coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami warning and shaking felt across tens of millions of people. And the final result was 2 minor injuries and 0 deaths. Compare that with an earthquake of similar overall energy release that struck a country without the same decades of investment in strict building codes and public earthquake preparedness, where the death toll ran into the thousands. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't the strength of the ground shaking itself. It was entirely the result of decisions made by engineers, governments, and everyday citizens, years and sometimes decades before the ground ever started moving. That comparison is exactly why an unglamorous, densely technical document like the National Seismic Hazard Model actually matters as much as it does. It's the scientific foundation underneath every decision that determines whether a future earthquake in your specific region plays out closer to the Japan outcome or the far more devastating alternative. I want to bring this back to something practical for a second, because information without any action attached to it is really just anxiety, and that's not the point of this video. If you live in a region that's part of this updated higher risk picture, whether that's California, the Pacific Northwest, or increasingly parts of the central and eastern United States, there are concrete, achievable steps that make a real difference, regardless of what the probability numbers eventually turn out to be. Knowing where your home's gas shutoff valve is located, securing heavy furniture and water heaters to the wall so they can't tip over during strong shaking, keeping a genuine emergency kit with water, food, flashlights, and any necessary medications ready to go for at least 72 hours. having an actual plan for how your family reconnects if cell phone networks go down, because they often do exactly when you need them most. None of these things require you to personally understand fault mechanics or probability models. They just require treating this specific kind of risk with the same seriousness scientists have clearly already assigned to it. Here's the piece of this entire story that I think deserves to sit with you the longest. A significant nationwide update to how this country understands its own earthquake risk was published, reviewed, and quietly folded into the systems that shape your insurance rates and your local building codes. And most people watching this video are hearing about it here for the first time, rather than through any major headline when it actually happened. That's not a conspiracy. It's simply how scientific risk assessment tends to move through the world methodically, technically, and largely out of public view, right up until the moment an actual earthquake forces everyone to pay attention all at once. The entire value of a video like this one is trying to close that gap just slightly, so that the information reaches you before the emergency does, rather than during it, when it's far too late to act on any of it. If this kind of story is exactly what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep tracking how this evolves, including further updates on Cascadia, the San Andreas system, and any changes to how these models get revised in the years ahead. Let me know in the comments, did you already know your region's risk level before watching this? Or did something in this video genuinely surprise you, whether that's the Cajun Pass earthquake gate, the overdue Cascadia rupture, or the fact that the biggest jump in national risk actually came from the northeastern United States? And if you know someone who lives in any of the regions we just covered, or honestly, anyone who's never once thought about their own earthquake risk, send them this video, because the science behind this already exists and is already shaping decisions about their safety right now, whether they know it or not.